Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another word from Pastor Dan. I just want to take a quick second at the outset here to remind you, if anything that you hear sparks something in you, or you have questions, or you have concerns even, feel free to email me anytime right at this address, pastordancook@gmail.com. I've really appreciated all the people who have liked the videos and have subscribed to the channel and have shared things out. Can't encourage you enough to keep doing that. That's really a big help for the channel. So in this week's text, we're going to return to the Gospel of Matthew. A reminder for those of you that aren't familiar with the Revised Common Lectionary, it's a 3-year cycle of passages. We're in year A right now, and it's based on the rhythms of the church calendar. Each week, the lectionary provides 4 texts, at least 4 texts. Sometimes they double up on some of these, but there's at least one Old Testament passage, at least one Psalm, a New Testament passage, and a Gospel passage. And whoever's preaching or whatever church is studying those can pick and choose from amongst those passages to look at and to examine and to study and to go deeper into. Sometimes I choose a passage because the story leads to a singular conclusion. There's a lesson, there's something there that I think people need to see and need to hear about. But this week I picked this text because there's actually 3 different themes within it in a singular story that I think there's lessons for lots of different people from lots of different angles. So let's go through this text and let's see what those themes are and what we have to learn, shall we? So this is Matthew 14:22-33, and I'm reading from the NRSV. Immediately he made the disciples get into a boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasing in your sight, O Lord. Amen. So I think there are 3 different themes that I want to talk about in this particular passage. There's themes of solitude, there's a theme of courage, and there's a theme of faith. Solitude, courage, and faith. So let's begin with solitude, shall we? Because that's where this passage begins, with Jesus seeking solitude, seeking someplace quiet to pray. Let's look again quickly at verses 22-23. Immediately he made the disciples get into a boat and go on ahead to the other side. So this is Jesus sending the apostles off so he has a little bit of alone time, while he dismissed the crowds. The passage right before this is the feeding of the 5,000. So Jesus is sending the crowds off as well. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. So we have Jesus seeking this solitude, which actually turns out to be something he does quite often. In Luke 4, you see Jesus head to the wilderness before he's going to begin his public ministry. In Luke 6, he spends the night alone in prayer and then goes out and he's selecting his 12 apostles. In Mark 6, Jesus sends all the 12 off to do their own ministry, again, alone time for him, and upon their return has them separate from the crowd in order to rest. In Luke 22, you have the story of Jesus praying solemnly before he was arrested. And there are plenty more examples, including, like I said, just before this, we have Jesus feeding the 5,000. And immediately prior to that, you have Matthew 14:13, where it says, "Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself." The this in this sentence, now when Jesus heard this, that's Jesus hearing about the death of John the Baptist. So you start to see a pattern in all of these, right? That Jesus is spending time alone, spending time in solitude, either right before something big happens or right after something big happens. And often it's both. So what is there in that for us? Why is it important to point out that Jesus seeks solitude? Well, look, The world's not so simple as to be able to be divided into extroverts and introverts, but for this exercise, we're going to do that. Now, if those of you that are introverts like me, and I am a card-carrying introvert for sure, I have a t-shirt in my closet that says Introverts Unite separately in your own homes. So I get it. So for those of us that are introverts, that time that we need to rest and recharge, Jesus needed that too. And he identifies and he understands why we need that. We should never ever let anyone make us feel guilty for taking that time for self-care. And we have to realize not everybody's going to understand why it is that we need that time, and we have to accept that as well. Now, the inconvenient part is for those of us that are very comfortable in that solitude, we also have to understand that we don't get to stay there forever. Jesus didn't stay in that solitude place forever. He stayed there, he prayed, and then he got back to work. And that's a lesson for us as well. We can't just live in that solitude, much as we might like to. You can't stay there forever. We are social creatures that need other human beings, and we need to be out and dealing with other people as well. Now, for those of you that are extroverts, I don't understand you. I love you, but I don't get it. I really, really don't. I do understand that you get life from socializing and that choosing solitude can actually be a very difficult thing for you. Well, Jesus loved to socialize too, right? There's all kinds of stories of Jesus at weddings and at big dinners and hanging out with, again, thousands and thousands of people. So Jesus loved the social life as well, but he also made sure to balance that with solitude, balance it with quiet time. He found that right balance for him. And that balance point is going to be different for all of us, but there is a balance point to find because nobody's battery is inexhaustible, not even yours. And I've seen plenty of extroverts that think their battery just will go on forever, and it doesn't. And when it stops, they crash hard. Which is why God created the Sabbath, right? Because slowing down and resting and recharging, that's an integral part of God's creation, even for you extroverts. So Jesus understands us, introverts and extroverts alike, and he understands the necessity of solitude for all of us, even to the varying degrees. Jesus gets that. Solitude is important. Solitude is important, and so is courage. Let's go back to the passage for a moment and read verses 25 to 27. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." This is another section like I talked about last week when I said that there are some passages in the Bible that we know so well we don't actually know them at all. This is one of those passages. Who doesn't know the story of Jesus walking on the water? We've seen that image and that iconography in art for centuries. But we don't really understand what's behind it. We got to dig into it a little bit. The first thing is you've got to put yourself in the mindset of the apostles on the boat, which is difficult to do because we, the reader, know right away that this figure that's walking towards them on the water is Jesus. We know that. And so you have to try to forget that or force yourself to forget that for a second to really understand their mindset. Think about it. Okay, they're on a boat. It's very late at night or very early in the morning, however you want to phrase it. The passage says early in the morning, but the actual translation there is fourth watch, which would have been like 3 to 6 in the morning. So it's that pre-dawn time when most people are not usually awake. That's the time that this is happening, and that's important to remember. So it's that kind of early morning, late night, however you want to look at it. And now you're out on a boat, which verse 24 tells us has been battered by the waves all night long. And that means, of course, you haven't been sleeping very well because of the noise, because of the rocking motion. So it's a time when people usually aren't awake. You haven't slept very well. And oh, by the way, yesterday, Jesus just fed 5,000 people with a couple of loaves of bread and a handful of fish. So your brain is still melted from that experience, trying to get your head around that. And in that frame of mind, in a time where you're not supposed to be awake, you haven't slept very well, your mind's been blown, you look out across the water, and there's a guy walking on the water, which is something that everything in your life tells you cannot happen. Put yourself in that mindset. The terror and the fear that it mentions there in verse 26 is very, very real. I don't know about y'all, but I'd need a new pair of shorts if I looked out and saw that. And that's when we get to this quote from Jesus in verse 27. Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. Let's break that down. Take heart, the word that's rendered take heart there can also be rendered take courage. So Jesus is commending them to have courage in this situation. Why should they have courage? It is I, Jesus says. And there's more to that than just Jesus saying, hey guys, it's me. Because when you go back to the original languages here, we have to remind ourselves constantly, the Bible didn't come to us in English, right? Any English version of the Bible is a translation from the original languages. And when you translate languages like Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic, it isn't just a one-to-one thing. There is some intentionality and there is some thought put into how you're going to render that in this new language, in the language of English. And sometimes when you do that, you can get it right and still lose a little bit of something. And that's what happens here. It is I is a perfectly valid translation, and it's a correct translation for this context to the original Greek haon. But if you were going to do a one-to-one rendering of haon, it would be I am. Does that sound familiar? Go back to Exodus chapter 3, verse 14. Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent you. God identifying himself as I am. So Jesus is telling the apostles, take heart, take courage, I am. Why do you take courage? Because God is with you. I am God. God is with you. You see how that works? And then do not be afraid. So you take courage because God is with you, and the result of that is that you do not be afraid. Now, that may sound like Jesus telling them, don't feel any fear. What's wrong with you? Why are you feeling fear? But that's not what Jesus is saying here. Again, I don't want to get too far in the weeds on the languages, but that phrasing, and again in the original language, has the indication it's a call to stop an action that's already in progress. Stopping an action that's already in progress. Well, fear is not an action, right? Fear is an emotion. We just feel emotions. I think we spend way too much time beating ourselves up over our feelings, which we can't control. What we can control is how we respond to those feelings, right? That's the action. So when Jesus is saying, do not be afraid, he's not telling them, do not feel fear. He's telling them, don't let the fear control how you react to seeing me walking on the water. You see how that works? Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. Courage, which Jesus just commanded them to take, is not the absence of fear. That's not what courage is. I'm a bit of a Civil War nerd, and one of the Civil War generals for the Union has what I think is one of the greatest definitions of courage I've ever heard. William Tecumseh Sherman once said, I would define true courage to be a perfect sensibility of the measure of danger and a mental willingness to endure it. A perfect sensibility of the measure of danger, understanding that there is fear, something to be afraid of, and then having the mental willingness to endure it. Take heart, take courage. It is I, God is with you. You don't have to let the fear control your actions. Jesus is reminding us that when we feel fear, we're not commanded not to feel it. We're not commanded to turn our feelings off. We're reminded that God, Jesus, is with us, and that with him, we can endure that fear and move forward beyond the fear. Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. So solitude is important, and courage is important, and so is faith. Faith is the third theme I want to talk about here. So let's go back and look again at verses 28 to 31. Peter answered him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. He said, come. So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying, you of little faith, why did you doubt? First sermon I ever gave was called The Problem with Certainty. And I feel like if there are topics that I am meant to discuss, that God has put me here to discuss, faith and doubt and certainty are certainly high on that list. Because here we have a situation where Jesus says something and people have used it to browbeat other people and to shame other people for far, far too long. You of little faith, why did you doubt? If only, Peter, you had had more faith, you wouldn't have nearly drowned, you miserable, no good, worthless creature. Do we really think that a God who so loved the world that he entered into our existence, lived a human life, and was tortured and died for us would really turn at us and go, "You have little faith. Why did you doubt?" Scolding us like that? I don't think that's what's going on here. I think something else is going on. And I think the big part of that something else is going on is that we failed to focus on the first half of that verse, verse 31. And we focus entirely too much on the second half. "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" To understand what I mean, you have to look at Peter here and his role in this story. I love Peter. Peter's one of my favorite people in the Bible. I love him. He is a man of action. He doesn't always think those actions through before he does them, and oftentimes his actions don't really fit the context that he's in. But man, Peter is going to do something. He is a man of action. He's going to run through that wall and leave a Peter-sized hole in it. So what is Peter's reaction here, right? Everybody is in this boat is scared out of their minds. They think they see an apparition walking on the water. And as soon as that apparition identifies itself as Jesus, Peter immediately turns around and says, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Like, "Hey, cool, it's you, Jesus. Can I try that walking on the water thing too?" If Peter was a man of little faith, would his first thought have been, "Hey, I bet Jesus can make it so that I can walk on the water too"? Would that really have been his reaction? Of course not. Peter is a man of tremendous faith, which is why Jesus chides him at the end of this passage. He's a man of tremendous faith, and he's a human being, susceptible to questions and doubts when circumstances overwhelm him. Remember, at the end of the gospel stories, Peter denies Jesus 3 times because he's so overwhelmed that his mentor has been arrested and is about to be executed, and everything he thought life was going to be is suddenly not there anymore. He's susceptible. He's a human being. But what happens here? Peter has faith in Jesus, steps out of the boat, and starts walking on the water towards Jesus. And then he notices the wind, right? Remember, the boat's been being battered by wind all night long. The wind picks up. The wind hits him with a gust. Maybe he gets off balance a little bit. The circumstances begin to overwhelm him, and he panics and starts to sink. But what is the first thing he does upon starting to sink? He says, "Lord, save me," cries out to Jesus, reaches out for Jesus. "God, Lord Jesus, save me." And what's Jesus's reaction? This is what I meant by we got to start focusing on the front half of verse 31 instead of the back half of verse 31. Jesus's reaction is Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him. That's Jesus's first reaction, not to chide him, not to condemn him, not to shame him, but to reach out and actually save him. That's what Jesus does. And that's the context we have to read that second half of the verse in. Faith is not perfect, ladies and gentlemen. It is never 100% of the time. And anybody who tells you that you have to be free of doubt in order to have faith doesn't get it, doesn't understand. The opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is needing certainty. Doubt and fear and uncertainty, those are all part of the human condition. Faith is trusting in the fundamental character of God that Jesus displays on the cross. Faith is stepping out of the boat when it makes no sense at all to do so, and trusting that if things go sideways, Jesus will be there to help you. And that doesn't mean we get to go out and do any old crazy thing we want and Jesus is going to be there to pull our fat out of the fryer. That's not what that means. What it means is that in the times where doubt and fear and uncertainty are creeping up on you, you can trust in God's character. You can lift those things up to God, and Jesus will be there to help you through it. Notice what happens. Peter walks toward Jesus, walks away from the boat toward where Jesus is on the water. And it doesn't say that when he starts to sink and Jesus reaches out and grabs him, he picks him up and throws him back bodily back into the boat. No, it says when they got into the boat. So they're away from the boat. Jesus saves Peter, and then they walk back to the boat to get into it. God will help you through your doubt. God will help you through your uncertainty. Lean into your faith. God will be there to help you. So these are the 3 themes that we can pull out of this story. There's solitude, where it tells us that it's okay and it's often necessary to seek solitude. Jesus understands that need, and Jesus encourages those who maybe don't understand it as well to better understand it. Either way, you don't have to apologize to anybody for your self-care. And courage. Courage is important, right? Because it's not the absence of fear. It's about understanding that we need to acknowledge that fear and lean on God to help us move forward through the fear. If the idea of you admitting that you're afraid brings up fears of or concerns about mockery and contempt, then you're probably getting your value from the wrong people. You probably care about the wrong people's opinions. Remember, your value comes as a creation of God. That's where it comes from. And nobody else's opinion of you matters other than Jesus's, who chose to die because he thought you were that valuable. Which leads us to faith, solitude, courage, faith. Because we have to remember, faith is not being 100% free of doubt. That's not what faith is. Faith is trusting God's character and saying it's okay to feel that fear. We just don't let the fear control us. We lift the fear up to God, and God will be there to help us through it. Solitude, courage, faith. Three very important themes, three very important things to understand from a biblical perspective, and they're all woven together in this beautiful story of Jesus walking on the water. Amen? Amen. Again, as I said at the front of the sermon, if anything here strikes you or you want to talk more about it, feel free to engage me. Email me, pastordancook@gmail.com. I'm not asking for any money. I'm not asking for any material support. Again, if you could just like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this out to other people, that would be a big help. Appreciate it very, very much. So thanks for being here, and I hope you'll join me next week for another word from Pastor Dan.